Welcome back. And I have to start in the middle of things because I didn't finish last time. I tried to keep the lecture strictly to an hour and I ran out of time. I was in the middle of talking about this dispute between Roger Williams and John Winthrop. Now, John Winthrop, you remember, was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a major investor in the company. It was run by a company. Like any other company, it had many stockholders, but the largest one, the most important one, was John Winthrop. He had put in a lot of money to get the company going, and so he was the governor as the major stockholder, major investor. So he ran the colony. And with him was Roger Williams, who was a pastor in one of the churches in the colony. So it's the boss versus one of the pastors. And the issue between them was that John Winthrop had this vision that I talked a little about last time, to have Massachusetts Bay be an example of a Christian community. It was going to be a community where people were going to live by the rules of Christianity, and it was going to show the world that a Christian community could survive and thrive and prosper, that God would reward it, it would be a happy place, people would get along, and it's going to be run by the biblical codes of Christianity. Williams agrees with that completely. They're both committed to the idea of a Christian community in America. And they've gone to America, both of them, because they couldn't do that in England. And they were frustrated because the English society would not allow that. And the Anglican Church was the Church of England, and it just simply would not accept the way that people like Williams and Winthrop and the other Puritans who've come to America, the way they interpreted Christianity and so forth. So these guys have come there in order to set up a church to run the way they think it should be run. But the difference is that Winthrop had a view that, all right, we're going to have these Christian churches, we're going to have these Calvinist churches, and each one is going to be self-governing. Remember, I mentioned that was one of the main points that the Calvinists had to reject the Church of England. You know, the Church of England, like the Catholic Church, had a hierarchy of the Catholic Church had a pope, there are bishops, there's people who run the church, and the churches are all run from the top, and the pastors are all appointed by the bishop, and the people just go to church. And the Calvinists rejected that. The Calvinists said people have to participate in the church itself. And one of the things they have to do is to decide who can be in the church. So the church is limited to people who are self-professed as Christians, who have convinced other Christians already there that they are Christians, and it's limited to that. But Winthrop said, okay, each church has to be self-governing, but they have to be part of a larger community. That's why he rejected what the Christians had done in Plymouth, what the so-called Pilgrims had done in Plymouth. And if you remember, he called them separatists because they only allowed the churches to be by themselves. And they had left England and had just cut off all ties with English society and culture and everything. And Winthrop said, no, you've still got to be tied to a larger community. And there's like different layers of communities. There's the community of a single church, and then there's the churches of a singular area. And then there's all the churches, all Christian churches of a country. And then ultimately, there's all mankind, and we're all part of a community. We're all children of God. And specifically, he said that in Massachusetts, while the churches are self-governing, they have to be sort of tied together. They have to have links. And they have to be under some sort of supervision to make sure that they don't sort of go off the deep end with some religious idea that's not biblical, that's not in accordance with what people understood to be the words of Jesus. So the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church solved that problem by having outside authorities, by having a bishop who would oversee things, by having an archbishop who would oversee those, by having, in the Catholic Church, by having a pope to oversee the bishops, and the pope's in charge of everything. And that's what the Calvinists reject. That's why they split away from the Catholic Church, was because they felt that churches had to be self-governing. But Winthrop says, okay, you've got to be self-governing, but you still can't allow a church just to go on by its own and maybe develop into some sort of extremist outside weirdo organization. And for Winthrop, instead of having the bishop do that, or a religious hierarchy, he felt that what we could do is have the colonial government, which is the Massachusetts Bay Company, which is him, oversee the churches and sort of tie them together into a larger community, and then provide some sort of uniformity of belief among all of the different congregations. So he believes that there is a role for the government, the state, to oversee and kind of supervise churches and tie them together into this larger community of Christians in all of Massachusetts. Well, Roger Williams was what we might call a hardcore Calvinist. He rejected that totally. He said there can be no tie between church and state. Each congregation has to be absolutely independent, absolutely self-governing by itself, not subject to any outside supervision or control, whether it comes from the bishop or the pope or the governor of the colony. So he just rejected Winthrop's vision of how Massachusetts should work. He insisted that his church had to be totally independent, totally removed from any outside or superior control. And as I mentioned, he also then said that many of the Calvinist churches in Massachusetts were not following the rules. And he's a hardcore. He's a serious Calvinist who took this absolutely seriously. And he said each church has to be very rigorous about deciding who they're going to admit. They have to be real tight of following the rules that only people who are true Calvinist Christians can be admitted. And he took that very seriously. In his own church, he followed the rules rigorously. And I always get a kick out of asking students when I'm in class, how many members do you think he had in his church? Because he's so rigid about only admitting that the people who are absolutely convinced of their Christianity and that they convince the other members. And so how many members did he have in his church? You get a kick out of doing that because the answer is 2, Roger Williams and his wife. Those were the only true members of his church because he was so adamant about following the rules and admitting only the true Christians. And he's looking at many of these other churches all around Massachusetts, and they're springing up all the time. New churches are being formed. New towns are being settled. People are flocking into Massachusetts from England. And the numbers are growing, and people are forming all of these towns, and supposedly they're setting up all these churches, and a lot of the churches there were churches in name only. They didn't really function. There weren't enough pastors to go around, and a lot of churches, they don't care about the having this pure church religion. They just want to have people come in and settle, and a lot of people were coming there not because they care about religion, not because they reject Anglicanism, but just because it was a way to get some land. So, and all you have to do is sort of, you'd have to sign some sort of a contract with the people. They'd form they'd have these little contracts that they would sign among themselves, many of which are still in archives and museums and so forth. A lot of people couldn't sign, they just marked the X, but they'd say, you know, we're going to live this as a community, and we're going to be following the rules of Christ, and we're going to live according to the rules of Christ, which is that it's going to be a community based on love. We're going to love one another. And so we all do this. But a lot of people may just sign their name because you have to sign your name in order to get some land, so who cares? And for Williams, that's not right. You've got to follow the rules. Everybody's got to be, if you're going to have a church, you've got to limit it to the people who can really show that they are sound Christians and prove that to everybody else. So he and Winthrop just didn't agree. And after some discussion and debates and meetings and so forth, Williams was asked to leave. Winthrop's the boss. So Williams got kicked out. And he had many of his followers went with him. And they established another colony, which eventually took the name. It's a little complicated, and I can't get into the details. But eventually they became named Rhode Island. So Roger Williams established Rhode Island. And he set it up so that there was, in Rhode Island, there was his church. And as I said, he was very, very strict. Nobody could get into his church except himself and his wife. So he's really hardcore about that. But anybody could come and live in Rhode Island. Everybody's welcome to live there. He would encourage people to come there, and many people did because it was a pretty nice place to live. And you could get some land, and you know, it's a fine place. But I hope what you're thinking here is, now wait a minute, people can come there, but they can't be in his church. What they do is they set up a local government so that they can have a state, or they call it the state, we call it the state, but it's separate from the church. So what Roger Williams has established in Rhode Island was freedom of religion. Anybody could come there, and they couldn't join his church, but they could live there and they could be part of the community. They could be part of the what he called the civil society, the ordinary local government. And they could own land, and they could vote, and they could decide about taxes, and they could do all the other things that a local government does. They just couldn't belong to his church because he believes that the church has to be separate from the state in order that the church can be pure, that the church can be limited to the people who deserve to belong to it, and the church decides who they are. So he established that principle. So I've been talking about the Puritans as one group of people in England who did not accept Anglicanism. And they came to America in order to run a church the way they wanted to, although they weren't always in agreement of exactly what that meant. But they basically said that we're going to run a society according to the Calvinist doctrines of Christianity. And the Puritans were one of the very large minority groups within England. They were a definite minority, but they included some people who were fairly wealthy, and some of them were prominent. As I said, there were faculty members at Cambridge University who were Puritans, and so they had some influence. Another group of non-Anglicans in England were the Catholics. And the Catholics were generally poor. They didn't have prominent members like the Puritans did, not very many. And they kind of had a harder time in England dealing with the Anglican Church than the Puritans did. The Puritans, yeah, they complained about how the Anglican Church would not allow them to practice the way they wanted to, but the Anglicans were probably tougher on the Catholics than they were on the Puritans. So that's another group of people who don't accept the Anglican version of Christianity. They did, however, have one guy who was quite wealthy. He was a very wealthy guy, a very good friend of the king. His name was George Calvert. And he's one of the very few wealthy Catholics. In 1632, he decided he wanted to do something to help his fellow Catholics in England who could not run their churches. They could not have a Catholic church. The Anglican Church would not allow any Catholics to practice the way they wanted to. So to help them out, he convinced the king to give him some land in America. He named it after the king's wife, Mary. He named this Maryland. And as part of the deal, he got a title. He got a title of an upper-class member of English society. He's a lord. He became Lord Baltimore. And he became the proprietor, the owner of the colony of Maryland. And he owned it. This was not a company. This was a private individual who just got some land because of his close relationship with the king. And he then welcomed Catholics to come and live in Maryland. And so many Catholics took advantage of this. He's paying for it. These are not, the small farmers that are going to Virginia and going to Massachusetts, not people who are landowners in England and then can sell their land and pay their own way. These are poor people. These are farm workers, laborers, servants. But they got their passage paid by Calvert as a wealthy guy. And so he set up Maryland, and it became a functioning colony. This is now like the fourth colony in America that England has established at Virginia, Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1630. Now in 1632, Maryland as a Catholic refuge. But, Calvert's a rich guy, but he doesn't have infinite money. And he can only send a limited number of people over. I mean, he's paying all their way, and they're going over there, and they're doing what everybody does, grow tobacco. And that's just across the river from Virginia, so it's also tobacco country. So people could do that, and they're succeeding, but it's going to run out of money, and it's not having any more Catholics come because there's just no way for them to do it. So for the Calvert family, George himself died fairly early and was replaced by his son, but who became then the second Lord Baltimore. But what they're doing is, in order to get the thing to go, they're taking advantage of the one thing they've got, which is a lot of land. And the way they're going to make money, or the way they're going to survive, they're not ever going to become wealthy, but the way they're going to just be able to stay afloat is the obvious thing, selling that land. So they're going to start selling land to people to come to Maryland, and the price was low enough that a person in England could sell their land, pay their passage, come to America, buy the land from the Calvert family, and become a small family farmer in Maryland, the same as in Virginia, the same as in Plymouth, the same as in Massachusetts. It's a land of small family farmers. And Maryland is no different. And again, but it started out as just Catholics whose way is being paid. Now, more and more, it's getting people who are from the English middle class, and they're coming to America by the same way as everybody else, selling their land in England, using the money to pay their passage and get over and get established in Maryland. And the price of land was so much lower in Maryland that you get a lot of land with the same money you use to sell your land in England. But who are these people? Well, they're not Catholics, because Catholics were not prominent among the landowners of England. They're Calvinists. The Calvinists were the people who were big part of the English middle class. So after several years, what had started out as a Catholic colony is getting more and more Calvinists. And the Calvinists don't accept Catholics. And the Calvinists probably are more anti-Catholic than the Anglicans. And yet those are the people who are now becoming more and more prominent in Maryland. So in 1649, Maryland adopted, as a way to protect Catholics, they adopted the Act of Toleration, the Maryland Act of Toleration of 1649. And that granted freedom of religion to all Christians. They didn't accept Jews. Roger Williams did. Jews could go to Rhode Island, and the oldest Jewish temple was established in Rhode Island, like in 1640 or something. So the Act of Toleration was not very complete. It only applied to Christians, but it did allow all Christians to worship. And that was done in order to enable the Catholics to preserve their religion, even though pretty clearly the colony is going to be run by Calvinists. So to protect Calvinists, or protect the Catholics against the Calvinists, Maryland adopted the Act of Toleration. So we had a second colony in America which granted freedom of religion, at least somewhat. They didn't allow anybody but Christians, but at least all Christians were allowed to settle and live and work and participate in Maryland and then Rhode Island. So that's two. Then another group that I want to mention in England that did not accept Anglicanism, another one of the dissenting groups, was a more kind of a radical group that were sort of Christian, but very non-conventional Christians. They didn't have pastors, and they certainly didn't have any kind of a hierarchy like the Anglicans did. But and their beliefs are kind of complex, and if I had more time, I'd talk about that. But I just have to keep moving here, so I don't get to, as I said, I don't get to spend time talking about religion like I'd like. But these were a group called the Quakers, and Quakers were people who were considered kind of radicals. Their ideas were not at all traditional Christianity. Many Christians said they were not Christians because they didn't accept many of the ideas of a church, and they didn't have a pastorate, and they didn't do the same things that other Christian churches did. But these were a lot of them were young people in England, and they're very radical, and they're very devout people and very committed to their faith. One of them was a young guy named William Penn, Jr. And as you can guess, his dad was also William Penn. William Penn Sr. was a very serious, very important Anglican, a good solid Anglican, and an admiral in the Navy. He was one of the top officers of the Royal Navy, and as such he's very close to the king, and he's a good friend of the king and everything. But he's just, he's very, very traditional, very old-fashioned, absolutely scandalized by the fact that his son, William Penn Jr., is, of all things, this Quaker, this wacko religious freak. So that was a big scandal for poor William Penn Sr., and a very great embarrassment to this very substantial, old-fashioned guy who's a friend of the king. And here his kid is this hippie kind of freak. Well, William Penn served the king as his admiral and was a very important part. So to reward him, the king also gave him a big block of land in America. And like the Calverts in Maryland, this was given to him as a private possession. It's not a company, it's not a charter. It's not running on a charter like Plymouth and Maryland, like Virginia and Massachusetts. So it's his possession, and it was named Pennsylvania after him, and he's going to start thinking about how he's going to settle it and how he's going to make money out of all of this land that he's acquired in America. And before he could even get started, he died. And then the property became that of his hippie Quaker son, William Penn Jr. Who's this Quaker? So William Penn set up Pennsylvania as a colony, but he's welcoming Quakers. He's saying Quakers can come there and they can do whatever they call it, if you call it worship, They can practice their religion the way they want. And as a Quaker, he said, anybody can come. All religions can come. He did limit it to Christians, so that he's not as much committed to freedom of religion as we might like him to be, but he did welcome all Christians, including, by this time there's a lot of other kind of dissident groups in England. There's Baptists, there's Congregationalists, there's going to be Methodists a little bit later. Anybody could come and settle in Pennsylvania. So from the get-go, Pennsylvania becomes a third colony that allowed freedom of religion, and it's because William Penn just believed in that and felt that he would welcome Quakers, and that's the group he was interested in and that he would solicit from, but he'd welcome anybody. And so Pennsylvania also became a place where people could come buy land from from William Penn Jr. and then his descendants over a couple generations, and it became another colony, a third colony, which allowed freedom of religion. So that freedom of religion got established in 3 colonies. Now, it was only in those 3, but other colonies were still Anglican, except the New England colonies, and New England got a little bit complicated because as spin-offs from Massachusetts, there was Plymouth, and then there was New Hampshire and Connecticut and so forth, and those were run by Puritans, and the Puritans there were pretty, they insisted that you had to be an Anglican or had to be a Calvinist in order to become part of the church, and they followed that more or less rigorously. They weren't always, certainly as far as Roger Williams was concerned, they weren't real diligent about it, but at least that was the rule. The other colonies were all technically Anglican, and technically there was no freedom of religion in those other colonies, which I haven't gone into one at a time, but they're getting to be more and more all along, but that's another story. I just don't have time to get into all of that. But all of these new colonies are set up. They're all set up based on the same basic principle of middle-class farmers, people who come here because they've got some assets in England that they can sell or liquidate in some way and use to pay their passage to come to America and get land. And because land was so much cheaper in America, sometimes you got it free. In Virginia, if you paid your passage by itself, that alone was qualified for some free land. In Massachusetts, you get free land, and all you had to do was sign a document to say that you were going to become a part of a Calvinist church. But whatever it was, the details are different in every colony, but the basic principle is they're the same. And theoretically, these are all Anglican colonies. But frankly, the Anglican Church never really followed the rules. They never really pushed on it. A lot of places they didn't have a church. The Anglican Church all of the churches were part of the Bishop of London. We were all under the Church of England. The Bishop of London was the administrator that included America. But he never had enough priests to keep the church going in America. People didn't want to become priests to go to America. If you wanted to become a priest, you wanted to stay in England. And so you had a hard time filling the churches. A lot of places there'd be a priest, but theoretically the community is going to be supporting him. They're going to be tithing to pay his salary. But a lot of communities wouldn't do that. I mean, people wouldn't tithe. And the only way that the priest could earn a living was by doing what everybody else did and becoming a tobacco farmer. So the Church of England, it's technically the church for all of America, but it really wasn't. It really didn't function very well. And frankly, most Americans had freedom of religion. The only place where you really would be in New England, and there the Calvinist church. If you tried to get too far away from Calvinism, they'd come after you. But and your text mentions some of the other people besides Roger Williams who got far away from the sort of the mainstream Calvinist church and ended up having trouble getting kicked out or whatever. So to be realistic, among the freedom that Americans have is, as a general rule, freedom of religion. It was only the official law in 3 colonies, but as a reality, as a practical reality, it was the way things went in other colonies as well, in most of the other colonies. There's another type of freedom that Americans have that they paid a great deal of attention to. They were very conscious of, and they made a big deal of this. And they felt they had this freedom, they had this right by being British subjects, because all British subjects had an important right, the right to a trial by jury. And that went back in England hundreds of years. It goes back to the Magna Carta, whatever, the 11th century or whatever it was. Long time before anybody in England started coming to America. And it's accepted as part of being an English subject that you have the right to a trial by jury. And people in England were real conscious of the fact that they and they alone have that kind of a right. And they considered themselves better than other people in Europe. They considered themselves better off because they have that important freedom that comes from the right to a trial by a jury. And that's part of being British. So the people who are coming to America, they still considered themselves British subjects, and like all British subjects, they have a right to a trial by jury. And this is just well established for all British subjects, whether they're in England or in America. And that right to a trial by jury got an important sort of emphasis point as a result of a big event that took place in England in 1689. Now, this is called the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution really related to things going on in England. It's complicated. The king was a Catholic, and well, it's a long story. Well, I'll tell you. He had only one child, and she was a grown woman. Her name was Mary, and that's his only child. And she's married to a guy named William of Orange, who was Orange is in the Netherlands. So he's a Dutchman, and like the Dutch, he's a good Calvinist. He's a strong Calvinist, and so was Mary, even though she's her dad is a Catholic, but she had married this guy. I think he was her cousin, but they got married, and that they're good Calvinists. So everybody figured, okay, the king at the time was James II. He's Catholic, but he's going to die. He's going to be replaced by his daughter, and she's a Protestant, so that'll be good. And by this time, England is there. At least she's not a Catholic, so that's a plus. So they figure, well, we can let James stick around. He's going to die, and then we'll get rid of this Catholic king by just letting him get old and die. But then he got married again, and he married a young woman, and they had a child, and the child is a boy, and now he's next in line. Even though he's just a baby, he comes ahead of his adult sister. So now they figure, oh, no. And the king's second wife was a Catholic too. So everybody figures, oh gosh, this little baby is going to be raised as a Catholic. So even when James dies, we're going to be stuck with a Catholic king. So they said, no, we can't let that happen. So it's a long story how they did it, but they forced him out, and then they invited William and Mary, his daughter and son-in-law, to come over and take their place as sort of the co-monarchs of England, Glorious Revolution, 1689. But I've been saying they did this. Who's the they? Well, basically these are people in England who are part of what we call Parliament. See, in England had always had a Parliament, which was another body that ruled with the king and had been around forever. It consisted of two houses, the House of Lords, whose members were all hereditary noblemen, like Lord Baltimore. Most of them could only become a member of the House of Lords by inheritance. It's based on inheritance. And then there's the House of Commons, which was elected by the people. But we have to be clarified to who we mean by the people here. The people are landowners. And the number was 50, it's complicated, but it's to simplify it. The number is 50 acres of land. You have to own 50 acres of land in order to be able to vote. And very few people in England own 50 acres of land. There's only that upper class of the big landowners. Your typical English yeoman farmer, the typical middle-class farmer, didn't own 50 acres, so he couldn't vote, even though he's a landowner. It's only the big landowners who voted. So the House of Commons is elected only by these big landowners. So you've got two houses there at Parliament. You've got the House of Lords, which is a bunch of rich guys who have a title that they inherited, and the House of Commons, which is a bunch of rich guys who are elected by their fellow rich guys, big landowners. But that's a body that does act as a sort of a counterpoint to the king. And forever, king and Parliament had feuded over power, over who had the right to do this and who had the right to do that in England. And as a result of the Glorious Revolution, Parliament won. It was Parliament that got rid of King James II, forced him to leave. It was Parliament that invited William and Mary to come over and be co-monarchs. But Parliament did that, and the deal was William and Mary, in order to become monarchs, had to accept the terms set down by Parliament. And one of the terms was that only Parliament could tax. And this feud had been going on between king and Parliament for centuries over who could tax and who could control things and who controlled money and who could do this and who could do that. And basically, as of 1689, it's now clear Parliament controls the money. And by controlling the money, Parliament controls a lot of what went on. Now, the king was still very important. The king still ran the government. He still had the whole royal bureaucracy under his control. He was still very, very powerful. But bottom line is, anything the king wants to do that requires money, he's got to go to Parliament. Now, no other monarch in the world at that time, or at least in the Western world, had that kind of limitation. England was alone. The other two big Western European nations, France and Spain, had kings that were basically absolute rulers. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted. They controlled the government, they controlled taxes, they controlled the church, they controlled everything. But in England, Parliament was supreme. So we use the term parliamentary supremacy to describe England as a place where, yes, the king is powerful and the king sort of runs the government, but the king can't act without much of the approval of Parliament, especially anything that involves money, which almost everything does. You know, sooner or later it gets down to a question of money. And only Parliament could tax, only Parliament could approve money, and the king was thus under sort of the control of Parliament. So we Americans are part of that. We are our idea of limited monarchy. Because we're British subjects. All British subjects live with a king, but a king who is not an absolute monarch. And people in England and people in America, all of whom are British subjects, we use the term British to describe everybody, and then they're either in England or they're in America, but whatever, they're British subjects. And they all look on this as a reason why England is so much better than the rest of the world, because we have limited monarchy. After the Glorious Revolution, England also adopted a Bill of Rights, and they put down rights that they said British subjects have. One of the most important ones was, of course, the right to trial by jury. But there are other rights with regard to law, with regard to arrest, with regard to trials. These are all important limitations on the power of the king. The king is not powerful, all-powerful in England, and that means America. So we as British subjects, we're pleased to be that. We consider ourselves fortunate to be British subjects because we live in a country which has a monarch, yes, and the monarch still has a very great deal of power because he still sort of runs the government. But his power is limited by Parliament, which at least has some popular input into who serves in Parliament. I mean, the House of Commons has to be elected by the landowners, and that's very few people, but at least there is some control over Parliament. So we think of ourselves as being very lucky, being very free, because we have these rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. And specifically, coming out of that Glorious Revolution was a little booklet by an English philosopher named John Locke. John Locke. And he wrote a couple of little, what are called treatises on civil government. And it's as sort of a justification of the Glorious Revolution. It's the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution that Locke wrote his booklets. And in that he asked this fundamental political philosophy question. What is the function of government? What's the purpose of government? And the answer is to protect our rights. People have rights. They're sometimes called natural rights because they come from nature. This is not something that the king gives you. Other people had said, okay, well, you have rights, but the king allows you to do this, king allows you to do that. And what Locke said, no, it's not that the king allows you to do it. It's nature that does it. It's because you're people. It's because you're human beings. As a human being, you have basic rights. And government exists. You establish a government. The people establish a government in order to protect their rights. And he used three terms. Locke used three terms to describe those rights. And those three terms, which for some reason they're always stated in this order, I don't know why it has to be in this order, but it's life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. John Locke's writings were totally accepted within the English-speaking world. As a philosopher, his ideas were the basis of everybody's understanding in education. Everybody who went and got an education in the British Empire, anywhere in the English-speaking world, if you went to school, if you went to college or upper school, you studied John Locke. And everybody is accepting the idea that Locke has of government existing to protect rights. And that's why it was so important that England adopted a Bill of Rights as part of this whole Glorious Revolution. Locke's books came out in the early 1690s, after the Revolution, and although he never mentioned James II or the Glorious Revolution, basically what he's doing is justifying those events. Because he asked the important question, what happens if the king fails to protect our rights? What if the king or the monarch or whoever fails to protect our rights? That's the only reason he's there. That's the reason why we've had a king. We allowed the king to come in and we gave him power to govern over us, but with the understanding that he's going to use that power to protect our rights. What if he doesn't do it? The answer may be pretty obvious. You can have a revolution. You can get rid of the king. No king is absolute. No king is guaranteed. The king is there to protect your rights. If he doesn't do that, you get rid of him and you get another king. And what Locke was implying, he didn't say this because he presented this as sort of abstract philosophy. But what he was saying was that what had happened in the Glorious Revolution was legitimate, it was okay, it was good, because it was all done in accordance with basic principles that he's putting out there, Lockean rules about government. And what he's saying the people of England had done, actually was just sort of the inner core of some of these very wealthy inside people in Parliament. But they got rid of a king because he was no longer protecting their rights. Not clear exactly what rights he wasn't protecting, but that's another question. But we got rid of him and we invited a new king in, or co-king, co-monarchs, William and Mary. So this is part of British political and social thought. Government exists to protect the rights of the people. If it fails, we can change the government, and ultimately, government is responsible to the people. So all of this is taking place in England at around 1689, and we're part of it. We didn't really have anything to do with the Glorious Revolution. It was all done by people in England. It didn't involve any Americans at all, but we said, hey, this is great. This is what we want. We're entitled to this. We're British subjects. We're entitled to these rights. So all of these things are happening, and this gives Americans this sense that they have rights, and those rights are guaranteed by the English government. And they started thinking about the English Constitution. There wasn't really a written Constitution. The Constitution is just sort of the way things work. But the way things work in the British Empire is that Parliament exists. Parliament it's set up in a certain way. The way that it's set up is all done by the Constitution. And it's Parliament that controls taxes. Parliament controls the money. And the king then has to accept the sort of dominance over him, at least in financial matters, which are crucial, that his power is limited. And we're excited about that. And we think, yes, these are our rights. Of course, the most important right for Americans, which they are very aware of and they talk about a lot, is one that I talked about last time. And that is the right to own land. Owning land is sort of the mother lode of rights. Owning land means that you are the master of yourself. That because you own land, you can take care of yourself. You can grow what you want, you can produce out there, whatever it is. As long as you have some land, you can take care of yourself. You don't depend on anybody else. Most people in England didn't own land. Most people in England depended on one of the big landowners to let them live on their land, and in order to survive. The only way you could survive in England was if you worked for somebody else who would allow you to live on his land, to work for him on his land, and then to have some of the produce of your production for your own use to survive. But you were absolutely dependent on a big landowner. Well, if you're your own landowner, you don't depend on anybody else. And that's freedom. That's liberty. That's what That's what America provides. And in America, because land was so cheap, because you could get it so relatively easily, most people own land. Whereas maybe in England, I told you land ownership was very limited. Maybe we've tried to estimate what it is, and it's very hard to do because it's very different in different parts of England. And historians who tried to study these things find it's very, very hard to get accurate numbers. But just as a rough number, I always tell people, say about 5% max of the people in England own land. In America, the comparable number, and this is just sort of a guess, again, we don't have real accurate data on this, but I tell people 75% of Americans own land. Now, we have to qualify that. We have to be very careful we understand what we're talking about. When I say 75%, I mean 75% of adult white males. By English law, only males could own land. Women were considered subordinate to their husbands. Their husband is the landowner. The woman is dependent on the husband. She's a dependent. The children are dependents. If they have some servants there who are just working there, they're dependents. They depend on the landowner. It's the landowner who has the freedom. It's the landowner who is independent, can take care of himself, and therefore it's the landowner who is the one with the freedom. And as a matter of politics, it's the landowner who could vote. Only landowners can vote, just as in England. It's the same rules as in England. It's just that whereas in England, the land ownership kept power in the hands of a very small elite of wealthy landowners, in America, the majority of white males own land. So I explained only males could own land. Women, if a woman, say, became a widow and she had no children, well, then she would own the land. But if she ever remarried, automatically the land went to the husband. So there were not a lot of wealthy women for very long, because there would be some men who would suddenly want to come out and marry them, because that's the man then automatically acquired all the land. The man is the landowner, whatever the circumstance might be as to how that came about. I say, yes, 75%, but I mean white male landowners. And of course then there's that other adjective in there, white. You gotta understand, we're talking here about freedom, liberty, but only for white males. By definition, Indians, people of color, were not considered part of the system. They are the natives here, but they are here only to leave, as I explained before. At least within the English culture, the Spanish did things a little bit differently. Their view of the Indians was a little bit different, even though they abused Indians just worse than we did. But the Spanish always said, well, the Indians are sort of people here. For us, no, the Indians, I mean, they're just savages. They don't use the land right, so they have to leave. And so they're not landowners. They're not citizens. They're not part of the system. So they are not included in the numbers. And then we have people coming from Africa. And we're going to be talking about those in the next lecture. Those are people who were slaves. Now this is a little bit complicated. And in order to sort of set the background for this, I need to talk about this whole subject in a little bit more detail. I think I still have a couple minutes to go, but rather than start this topic, I'll stop here, and then in the next lecture we'll start by talking about this whole question, which is going to become one of the most important questions in American history. something that some people try to pretend didn't exist. I don't mean to get into politics, but there's a group of people who are trying to set up what they call the 1619 Project to bring more awareness of the history of slavery into American schools, and I'll explain to you why they came up with that number 1619. But President Trump has been threatening to cut off federal funds to schools that incorporate the 1619 Project. He doesn't want people to study about slavery. He doesn't want to have any study of slavery in American schools. Well, no, you have to. You can't talk about American history without talking about slavery and without talking about racism. This is just, if you don't do that, you're just not being honest. You're not being historical. So we'll stop here, and then as a way to start the next lecture, a little point to remember, we'll start with the number 1619 and what that's all about.